I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to throw this out there. I have a channel over on YouTube, Life as a ... which basically hosts highlights from these audio conversations that I have with these great guests. They typically run 10 to 15 minutes, and they're there to kind of present a different vantage point. You know, for people that aren't into audio, aren't into podcasts, but are still looking for career advice, ideas, help, all that great stuff, send them over to YouTube. Like I said, Life as a ... And if you do get over there, I would love that like or subscribe. I mean, it's the best way to let that algorithm know that the content is worth sharing and should be out there. So anyway, I do thank you for letting me plug this a little bit, but I think it's about time to get into today's episode. One of the most fascinating aspects of hosting a program like Life as a is without doubt this very unique peephole it provides into the work and ways of living for many. Of course, aside from satisfying curiosities of listeners and myself, my hope is that these looks provide helpful insights to those considering a particular profession. And this episode today feels entirely representative of this mission. Our guest, a well-established and highly respected architect, takes us into his world and mind as far as how he views his work, philosophies, and approach to it all. No doubt, this is a special conversation I'm excited to share with aspiring architects, but also those with that curious mind. You won't regret this listen. Well, to get the ball rolling, let me fill you in on some of our guest details, and we can do this. Javier Villar Ruiz is a Spanish architect based in Barcelona and Tokyo, working internationally in architecture, urban, and interior projects through his studio, JVAD, Javier Villar Architectural Designers. And he's been a partner at Japanese studio Kengo Kuma Associates with a collaboration that spans 2 decades, and with Barcelona-based studio Cloud9. Now, some of the architectural projects he's directed are the Grand Merillion student residences in Geneva, Switzerland, and the new Vera Bridge over the Guadalquivir River in Seville, Spain. In the interior design scale, he has directed projects of relevance as far as the new stairs and atrium interior for the UNESCO-listed Gaudi's Casa Batlló building in Barcelona, Spain, and commercial projects such as the camper shops in Barcelona, Milan, Paris, and Munich, and the awarded Endo at Rotunda restaurant in London, UK. Further, he's collaborated with brands for the design of lighting fixtures and for the design of lacquered crafted tableware. Javier has shared his experiences in architecture and design through lectures in universities and congresses both in Europe and Asia. So, with all of this noted, love to welcome you to my conversation with Javier Villar Ruiz. Yeah, so welcome to the program. How are you doing today, Javier?
Very good. Thank you, Christopher.
It's quite the thrill to have you on this program. I do want to say this right off the bat. I'm up to about 160 episodes. You know, I've spoken to a lot of different people across a lot of different industries, entrepreneurs as well. And to be honest, the hardest type of person, hardest professional to track down has been an architect. I have no idea why. Maybe it's the nature of your work, the busyness of it all. I'm not sure. But for that alone, I'm truly thrilled to get into this conversation with you today. So thanks for taking some time.
No, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to share things.
Yeah, well, maybe we could just jump right into things here. I do have this first segment lined up, and it's something called Coloring Wikipedia. As my listeners know, it's just a segment where I read off a definition of something related to the guest. Surprise, surprise, I have you down here for architect. So let me read that off, and then maybe after you could share your comments. Sound okay?
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, all right, here we go. Architect. An architect is a person who plans, designs, and oversees the construction of buildings. To practice architecture means to provide services in connection with the design of buildings and the space within the site surrounding the buildings that have human occupancy or use as their principal purpose. Now, first take, I mean, this goes without saying, surface level analysis, like most people have an idea of what an architect's all about. And that's not the purpose of this segment at all. After here, like a more nuanced look at it. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on that definition.
Well, I think actually, first of all, is that this definition that you just read, which actually it matches well with the imaginarium of everybody. But then actually, when you start working in architecture, you realize that there is many paths that an architect can take. And I think that's good because we are in different fields. People go there with different objectives. But in architecture, because this meaning that you just read is actually quite limited, no? And everybody goes to architecture for that kind of vision, but actually you realize that there's many things that architects can be involved in, whether it's more legal things, whether it's more investment things. Now with AI and with basically technology, digital technology, also in terms of being involved in creating the architectures of those of information organization. So there's many things that can be done. It's just that architecture attracts to certain kind of people who actually have that objective that you just read, and then it becomes a bit of a bottleneck. I think lucky enough is not the only thing architects can do, and then basically we are not all trying to fit in the same box, no? So there's many ways an architecture education can lead you to.
Was this something that you had a clear understanding when you were entering into the field, or was that something that sort of like slowly unfolded over time?
I think if I look back, I mean, when I was thinking about everything we were going to talk today, and I look back into what my image of architecture was when I entered architecture university, I had no idea to tell you the truth. I think maybe that was good. Maybe that was a good thing. I would have been discouraged if I knew what I know now. But basically, I think what led me into architecture was because I've been always, when I was a teenager, I was always very interested about art and everything that is creative work, whether it's visual, music, comic books, writing, literature, etc. But at the same time, also, I was always somebody, I would say, with a certain discipline that also enjoyed more the technical engineering side of things. So I found
Mm,
architecture to be something in between that could match that bipolarism of between being
yeah.
very disciplined, perfectionist, or technical, let's call it technical, and then at the same time, liking to be involved in creative activities, right?
Yeah, yeah. I definitely have a question lined up for that I'd like to dive into in just a second. But before we do, maybe we could rewind a little bit here and just to learn a little bit
Hmm.
more about, I guess, I know you mentioned that there's so many different areas that you can go into in architecture, but
Mhm.
a day in the life, I mean, maybe a day in the life for you and what you're involved in. What
Right.
does a typical day look like when you're
What
involved in
does
a
it look like,
project?
right? So
Yeah.
I would say it really depends on when you start working in a company, and then later when you become, let's say, more experienced and you work, basically you oversee this project. So for example, when you start architecture, you probably normally if with this vision of the architecture as part of the design process, no, we were talking about that figure that we talked at the beginning. When you start working, you usually are working in less projects or maybe even specific tasks, and basically your daily life is like, you go, you have your instructions of what you need to develop. If you're working, I'm talking to you from in a creative office, because it's not the same working in a more technical, let's say technical, that's it, dry design, than in a creative. But in a creative field, you would be basically asked to get some ideas, some problems, try to study, whether it's with 3D, whether it's with drawing, whether it's researching for references a lot.
Hmm.
Architecture has been in the world for thousands of years. So there's a lot to look back and to find the same problems that we all have, because for centuries we had gravity, we had cold, we have rain. So problems are quite similar. So looking a lot back into what has been done is it's something that you do during your daily life a lot, especially when you start working in a studio. And then basically having discussions about that thing that you are developing, first with the people who are working in similar things adjacent to you, to make sure that what you're doing makes sense. And then maybe talking to people who are supervising to see the result of that work. And then there's a lot of communication. And I believe that 50% of what you discover when you design it comes from you designing it or drawing it. Other 50% comes from discussions. So in architecture, there's a lot of working and discussion, working or designing and discussion, compared to other fields like, let's say, art, where basically you need to convince yourself that what you're doing is meaningful, relevant, etc. In architecture, you're not going to build something. Somebody has to get paid for it, which is the company. So you need to basically a lot of discussion to convince or find solutions, and then make sure that we as a team, we're going to propose this solution and not this other solution. What is our preferred solution? And a lot of thinking is what you're going to show and how. There's a lot of that discussion. Then when you move on into, let's say, you become more supervisor, you start becoming a little bit, let's say, more diluted. Let's say I would start when I started as a young architect on 23, 24 years old, I would be involved in 1, 2 projects. Now I'm dealing with 15, 20, depending on the sizes, no? 20 projects at the same time.
Yeah.
And that's more about having the capacity to switch from project to project, because you will be attending those discussions of all these people that
Hmm.
have been telling you they have been working and they have been talking among themselves, and then they come to you with those problems, because architecture is about solving problems. And then they bring you those problems, the solutions that they have studied, and then making sure those are the best solutions, or maybe they are all the solutions. So there's a lot of discussion. So when you
Yeah.
become, let's say, more of a supervisor, you are very interesting, but very also, I wouldn't say delicate, I would say more like a energy demanding situation, which is you need to negotiate a lot. You need to talk to
Yeah.
those people who work with you as a team. They show you the solutions that they think they are the best, and then you have to actually somehow negotiate. And there's a lot of psychology involved to make sure you, out of that discussion, the best ideas comes out. And then you need to convince somebody who has been maybe 10 hours that something might be great or might be good, but there's something else. So that discussion, which is also a matter of evaluating somebody's work and trying to find the way forward in the best way, that's discussion, negotiation. And then you have the other one, which is you talk to the people you need to convince, which are the clients, developers, city hall. Architecture costs a lot of money to build, so it's not that you design something and you build it. It's not like you buy a canvas and you paint and then you have a painting. You basically have to convince somebody to spend a lot of money to do something you think is the best thing they can do for that problem they have. And basically means taking all that work you have prepared with your team and convince somebody that that's good, whether you know it's the best thing or whether you think it's not the best thing, but the thing that you want to do. There's also a lot of that. More about what you want to create. Other offices that are more technical is more straightforward because like you have a problem A, you solve it, that's it. But when you work with in a creative architecture, sometimes problem solutions and strategies are not necessarily, how to say, function based. They are very intuitive, have to do with your cultural background, with what you're interested in. That's the difficulty about being in a creative office, that you need to deal with proposing things that are not sometimes to be explained. So there's a lot of, what I want to say with this is that at the beginning you work a lot on design, but as long as you become more as a supervisor or a team leader or a design chief, there's a lot of discussion, psychology, negotiation. For those discussions, the output of those discussions are a step forward for the project and not a step backwards. And then I don't talk about the more functional discussions, which is to talk to the planning office, to talk to the engineer, to talk to the fire department. Those are that for me is like in every job. You have problems, people who know more than you discuss with them, you get their know-how, you involve it in your project. But that part of discussion, that part of convincing somebody what your intuition is, that's the way to go. That's, I think, a very, very important part of architect when you have already gathered some experience.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that insight because I think, like, again, surface level sort of like look at this profession. A lot of people would think that somebody's just sitting beside or sitting behind a computer and they're just designing. They're spending 90% of their time on the design of whatever they're looking to build or create. But the way you've just spelled it out there, the word that just was flashing through my mind is collaboration, collaboration, collaboration.
Absolutely.
Lots and lots of that. And also to that point of the psychology of it all and like the negotiation, certainly budgets play a big part of the work that you're doing, and a lot of give and take, I'd imagine as well. If you're trending towards being over budget in this area, okay, well, maybe you're going to have to trim things back here or make alternate plans. And that requires, again, a lot of collaboration and going back to those parties that you just mentioned of informing them of these changes or potential changes. Exactly. So yeah, like that's a really deep insight that I think is really incredibly helpful. I'm glad you spent some time sharing that because I think that really shines this bright light on the work that you're doing, not just being the design aspect of it all.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I do want to turn back to you. And you'd mentioned in terms of your pathway into it all, that you had this interest in, both the artistic side of things, but then also this technical side. Maybe we could dive into that a little bit more. Like, was this something that when you were younger, maybe in your youth, that you realized, okay, this profession would probably satisfy both of those needs or wants? Or was it something that you gradually sort of were directed to by others? Or how did that unfold?
Right. I've been thinking that a lot because, when you hit your 40s or late 40s, you start thinking why you took the chances or the choices that you took. And it all goes back, actually, in my case, as deciding to be an architect. It comes to kids' time. I remember when I was a kid, I used to be always, talking to some family of mine who would be kind of also interested in these kind of things, and talk to them about building a boat and building this and that. So the idea of creating has been always there. And then on my teenage, I spent many years studying art, photography, music. I studied music in the US, in Berkeley, in Boston. I studied art in Kansas City Art Institute as well. I studied photography. I knew during those teenage years, I knew I was not going to be in the art world. I kind of knew it.
Like, what was telling you why, like, what was reasoning behind not going fully into just the arts?
Somehow, maybe in my generation, the idea of maybe that I was born in 78. And in those years, probably art was actually still considered something that is really hard to pursue, And and not necessarily that you will be in control of actually being able to develop. I'm not even talking about succeed, but actually to make a living out of being an artist. Well, now it's there's so much artists basically communicating, going up there and convincing a certain amount of people that what you do is relevant. And now there's many other channels. There's social
Right.
media. But back then it looked like a very harsh path to go, and then you realize that back then especially it was more based on what your social context would be. So in my
Yeah.
generation, art was something that it was really, you had to almost be sick and be an artist because that's what you want to be, and
Yeah.
that's it.
Couldn't see anything
So
else.
exactly, like you do it because there's, that you are built for that, no? And actually, I
Right. Right. Right.
realized
Right.
I went to study music, I went to study art, and I had this impression when I went to Kansas City Art Institute in Missouri, and I went to Berkeley, and I realized, I was somebody creative. I was good at it, but I realized I was good at it because I was smart or intelligent, not necessarily
Hmm.
because of the talent. You would see kids there that were, even though you could say that they're not really even very smart, but somehow they had this magic, this spark. So I thought, architecture might be a place where you can do creative work, but basically you do it. Your foundation is being smart, being intelligent, being diligent, studying. With art, is
Yeah.
something that is totally out of your control. It's basically, or you're born for it or not. So those years that I was really into, every year I would study, abroad in these more artistic kind of formations. That's when that was very helpful to understand. I really love creative work. I love collaboration as well. In those summer camps, etc., you collaborate a lot with people who are from other countries and other backgrounds, cultural backgrounds. And but then also I realized, I should be doing something that I can, that I can be even more helpful. Basic architecture is a word that is creative. I wouldn't say it's artistic. Those who think that architecture is artistic is not at all. You can have your own definition of art, but it's basically, architecture is basically to do things which is useful things, solving specific problems. And then, of course, you have choices to make that are more aesthetic, visual, intellectual, narrative wise, very abstract. You could choose to do that, but that doesn't make it an art. But what I would like a lot about architecture is that collaboration that you highlighted. That you have to collaborate with a lot of people that know more than you. That's I think what is something very
Hmm.
interesting about architecture. You are surrounded by people who know more than you. And as an architect and a creative architect, you can choose who to collaborate with. You could just basically maybe be very technocrat and just collaborate with very technical disciplines or people who know a lot, which is totally necessary because architecture has to be built, has to be to support itself, has to be comfortable, etc., and safe. But then you can collaborate with craftsmen, you can collaborate with sculpture, you can collaborate with musicians. I mean, and the more
Hmm.
creative you do your work, you can do it in a way that it's inclusive of those more artistic disciplines.
Yeah.
So it's like, okay, maybe I cannot be a DJ or I cannot be a relevant photographer or whatever, but I can do architecture in a way that I can bring all these people in. And man, that's fantastic because they're going to do it
Yeah,
better
I'd
than you.
imagine. Like you're probably, you can intentionally go after people that you wouldn't normally, even consider
Absolutely.
working with, or maybe in the past, and like you're going to be growing and developing yourself in a different way just by kind of imbuing their expertise into whatever project that you're trying to get off the ground. It's a really
Absolutely.
interesting aspect to it all.
In a way, it's also being like kind of like an art director. You see what you're interested in and you design things to involve those interests. And that's why your cultural background it's so important. You are not the same architect if you have a background that is very artistic or somebody who's very, let's say, economical oriented. It really depends on your background. You're going to design a way on another one.
Which leads me to this other question as well. I mean, I understand that your background, you've been split between two major, global cities, Barcelona and Tokyo.
Mhm.
And then how did those two mesh up? How did that come about?
Well, Barcelona is the city where I grew up. That's where I studied most of my architecture studies. Actually, my degree is from Barcelona. Then I studied 1 year in Venice, the Architecture City of Venice. Then I studied also in Chicago in the IIT. But basically, I was very interested about Japanese architecture because at the time that I was finishing architecture school in 2003, 4, Japan was really mind blowing in the sense of they were creating this architecture, which was, I would say, was not even necessarily advanced in the sense of technically, but it was so unique, even in the ways that life is proposed, with a bringing up ideas that were very abstract, that they were,
Mm,
far from the European culture that was all based in, Cartesian thinking, function,
yeah.
follow function, etc. Suddenly, Japan had this very fresh, very unconventional, very free, mind thinking architecture. That was fantastic. And actually, in the last 20 years, many prescribed prices have been that came from Japan. And this is the result of those years that they were bringing to the world fantastic architecture. And basically, I remember I was in Barcelona. I studied in Barcelona. It was all very easy, and it was actually Spain was in a kind of in a high moment. So many people say, you went there because of the crisis. No, the crisis was 4 or 5 years later. I left in the moment where Spain was actually in a very good moment, especially architecturally. And I remember it was just a very impulsive decision. It was like, I finished my university. My grandma would give me a ticket to wherever I wanted. And I said, I'm not going to go to London, which is €100. I'm going to go to the farthest place in the world. And I just
take advantage. Absolutely.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
that's more of a joke. But yes, I said, why not to go now? And, after finishing university, so I traveled to Japan because I was very excited about knowing that architecture as well as their culture. And I went there as a tourist, as a young tourist. And that's when I said, I was very fascinated. People tell, you were fascinated about Japan. Well, I was fascinated about Tokyo. Tokyo is such an amazing creature, and especially now that I'm half here, half there, it's even more. I'm more even aware of that, no? Because I see the differences and I miss it and I hate it. And it was fantastic to see. It was a city that still was very unknown to the West. I wouldn't know anybody who has been in Japan, so I traveled there, and that's when I fell in love with architecture, with Tokyo, and being there. And then I started as an intern in a big company. And that at the time was not big. It was like a company of 20 something architects. It was a small office, but doing very good job, very good work. But because I was in Japan, I could see that. I could get informed about what they were doing there. Not the biggest works that came already to Europe and they were known, but actually new offices that were coming out. And then I decided to try to do my internship in one of those offices that were less known, that they were doing something very interesting that was new to me, even if I knew well Japanese architecture. And then there is these 20 years. So I was working in this company that was 20 something people, and now it's 400. So it was quite exciting, very demanding to take something that had a good potential and be one of those who have been since that time all the way to I left.
Yeah.
It has been very exciting, no? I would say
Yeah.
it was very exciting to be part of that growth. At the same time, that growth also came because there was suddenly Japan became, and now it's even annoying to see how much of everything it's about Japan. You see social media, a new Japanese method for the skin, like everything.
I know.
If it's Japanese,
I
means
know.
it's legitimate, no? So
I know.
So it was good to see that growth of the work of this practice being known abroad and now becoming one of the most important or most relevant architecture practices in the world, as well as being in a city that went from quite unknown to one of the cities that is most visited lately. It was very exciting, but it got to a point where it's like, okay, I've been here from A to Z. Done.
It's time for something different.
Done.
We're going to get to that in a second, but I have this other question too that I'd like to step into. And this is something that we've kind of touched upon a little bit already. And it has to do with this impression of your field from the outside looking in, where it's like this unique blend, I think, of, this technical skill and knowledge. Again, we brought this up before, but then also this creative side. And I think like stereotypically speaking, we often think as humans, we always kind of like group people in like, oh, you're very creative, but maybe you're probably lacking in the technical skill. Well, you, on the other hand, are very good with the technical skill, but probably don't have artistic or creative skills. Whereas architecture, at least to me, from the little knowledge that I have, it would seem that you have to have this unique blend of both of those worlds to be successful or to be competent. Your first take, I mean, what would you say to that? Is that something that you would, one, agree with? And then two, if you are a little bit less proficient in one of those areas, is it possible to develop that?
Sure. The thing is that cocktail, it's there. It's something that you need to do something that is serious, tangible, technical, but at the same time, it has to be exciting because you need to convince people to build those things. But I think that cocktail can go from very little of one and mostly the other one, or the opposite. Like you could actually, what is important is that you know what you're good at and what you're interested, especially what you're good at, because at the end, interest is something that you're responsible for. What you're interested in is something that you decide, or when you know to get yourself better, you say, okay, I'm better in this, so I'm interested in this, so you can develop, you have more potential. So I think you need to know yourself very well, because then I think there is practices. When I say practice, means offices, studios, ateliers, whatever you want to call it, because architecture practices take many forms. I think there is practices for all kinds of this cocktail. You can work in studios or companies that are basically very, very technical. At the end, when you design something, you need to make choices that are, let's say, sometimes intuitive, whether this is this thick or that thick. whatever. Even when you design infrastructure, all those decisions involve a certain sensitivity or personal choice. But there is some practices that are basically very oriented into the technical. And then you have practices that are more, let's say, balanced, where you design things that are very function oriented. But of course, there's some choices that you need to make because those designs have to please first those who build it and then those who will use it. So you get more work. Otherwise, you would have get more work. And then on the other side, there is work of architectural practices that are extremely creative, not function based. They are very close to art, but they are not art. And I've been in those too. I mean, the office I worked before in Barcelona when I was a student, we were making basically video games, or we were making scenarios for operas, and we were making things that were totally on the limit boundary between architecture and art. No, so you have this spectrum which could be totally technical or totally creative, and I think, and there's absolutely every single millimeter of variation in between. And I think what is difficult is to know where you are. So you need to know what's your skill, what's your potential, what you want to work, and then go there. Because when you finish university, I remember I didn't have those thoughts. You basically go to some office, or because somebody introduced you there, like it happened to me the first office I worked, or because a famous office. So I think it takes time. Actually, I don't think you need to finish university and know yourself in that way, and then okay, I'm going to do this. You need to work here, you need to work there, and you say okay, maybe, because sometimes those skills awaken when you are put in the right context. And also, that's very interesting. There's sometimes collaboration happening between practices. You could have a practice that is very technical, that actually develop technically what very creative offices do. I think it's that idea that you have to be an architect only if you can draw. That was not right 30 years ago, and it's even less right now.
Oh, it's interesting. One thing that I picked up on there is that you'd said, correct me if I'm wrong here, is that if you know yourself and what you're good at, you should be going into that, at least first. I'm really curious about that. I would think that maybe somebody might think like, okay, well, I am somewhat proficient in this sphere already, so I'm going to go in and address my weaknesses right away. But what you're saying is the opposite.
That could be.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I think it's up to what is your position. I think the important is that you know yourself. Then whether you choose to reinforce what you're good at, or I'm taking choices like that too, where you say, okay, I'm not so good at that, so maybe I'll choose that way, no, to try to see. And actually, sometimes you realize that there's a lot of affinity with you with that you didn't know because you were not put in the right context. There's people who go around in social media where they say, no, you have to know what you're good at and you have to do that. And so people who say the opposite. I think it's up to you.
Yeah. Now, it's another question I have as well. I mean, in terms of like inspiration, it would seem to be that a field that you need to constantly have this, obviously,
Yes.
to come up with ideas for your own projects and whatnot. So my question for you is like, how do you personally go about this? Maybe travel, culture, maybe that was a helpful thing, going to a place like Japan. That probably was a spark in some senses. But what are some other things?
Yeah, what people call inspiration is very important. At the end, when I was saying that architecture is about a lot of discussion, negotiating, whether people you're working with the people you're working for, clients, with the consultants that you're collaborating with because they need to tell you how big are the columns. There's a lot of negotiation. But the most difficult of all is negotiation with yourself. When you're designing something, who decides if what you're doing, if you think that what you're doing is good or bad, or relevant or not relevant, or you're interested or not, it's you. That happens a lot. You might be working, designing, and then you wake up the day after and you realize, oh, what you did, it was terrible. And the day before, it was fantastic. No, every creative work has that. And that negotiation with yourself, it's complicated. And at least for me, sometimes could be very painful or could be very exciting. I guess it depends on how good things go. I think inspiration is not necessarily something that you take and then that makes you have an idea. It's more about something that you take and makes what you are designing somehow make sense. Like in a way that you might be designing something and then you have seen an inspiration, because inspiration is not something that you see and you say, boom, and then you're going to do something. Like in art you would say, you see a bird doing something and then you do this. No, in architecture, it doesn't happen like that, because you could see something that inspires you, but maybe it's not useful until 3 years later when you are designing a museum and not a church, or you are designing something in the forest and not that. So I would say inspiration is basically, in architecture, is basically a toolbox of things that you gather through observation, experience, discussion, mistaking, whatever. It's a kind of luggage that you bring with you, and that it's there, and that you are excited about it enough to actually bring it to you and keep it in your toolbox. and then comes later. It becomes handy when you are designing
Yeah.
something. It's like architects don't design what they want. It's not that I want to paint a bird and then I paint a bird. I mean, I have to design what I've been asked to. So inspiration, it's an intuitive hard drive that you have that you don't know. That's why interest is very important in architecture. What you're interested in.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because I might see
Yeah.
something and not get interested about it, but some things, for example, you go to another country, as you were saying, traveling is very important because you see things in different ways. There's a lot of things at the end. With architecture, you design life and how you live or how you perform. Human activity is done in a sheltered way. That's done culturally and technically differently all around the world. So when you see the same things, the same problems solved in different ways, basically you start opening possibilities of how to deal with problems later on. In architecture, intuition is experience. Experience comes through observation. Of course, traveling is it's very important, but I don't think it's necessary. There is people who have great sensitivity that they can even learn so much from observing their usual context. But observation is very, very important, and talking to people and see how they do things. For me, that's inspiration.
It almost sounds like a way of life, a way
I
of
think
living, like this just kind of like an osmosis, just kind of like sucking
it's
up,
like
or I
osmosis,
like the word
exactly.
that you used, like a sensitivity to, the context that you find yourself within and being aware of that and possibly the reasons for it. Maybe you're conscious of it at times and other times you're not, but you're almost training yourself to be aware of what's going on you at all times. Because like you said, you never know where that's going to come in handy. It becomes downloaded into that consciousness of who you are and what you represent and whatnot. Okay, that's really interesting. Yeah, this other question as well, as far as like, we've touched upon some of the aspects of being an architect, obviously at this point, but what would you say are a couple of things that are overlooked when we're looking at this profession that are, in your mind at least, critical to to excelling or to doing a good job within within the work itself?
Yes, that kind of connects with one thing that I said before, like psychology. If you want to work in architecture, not just designing, but making designs happen, and that means this collaboration dimension that architecture has. Psychology is very important. You need to negotiate. You need to make sure your ideas, whether they are yours or the others, because maybe you realize somebody else's ideas are better, but to bring that, whatever it is that you think is the best, to bring that further, because you really believe so, that involves a lot of psychology. You need to like to be with people. You need to like to discuss with people, to have conflict, to argue, to agree to disagree,
Yeah.
to be excited about something, to scold somebody, to discourage somebody. That dimension, I think that is overlooked. I mean, nobody told us about that dimension when we were studying. That makes people, when we start working, that some people who basically are not so comfortable there or they don't want to have that interaction with people, that they basically go into a specific way of practicing architecture, which is more isolated, maybe more, as you were saying, more being in front of a computer, basically not discussing too much. But then this skill of maybe not even skill, this pleasure or this willingness to interact with people, it brings the potential of a different way of working, which is basically making those designs happen. No? And when you do a project in architecture, even if it's a small project, no? Even you do a house, maybe there's 50 professionals involved when you work in a very high level. So you need to talk to all those 50 people. You like them or not. You're interested about what they say or not. So I think that's something that is overlooked. That dimension, it's something that we don't know and it takes you by surprise. I was lucky enough that love people. Okay, I love this. But if not, I would be suffering.
Yeah, yeah, it would be placing a limit on you almost
Mm,
in a sense, right? It'd be a limiter in a lot of
absolutely.
respects if that wasn't your personality, and suddenly you find yourself having to negotiate and deal with all these different types of people when this
Exactly.
isn't anything that you'd expected. So I'm glad that you're reinforcing this point, because this is something that, again, at least from an outsider like myself, from all of this in this conversation, I would have no idea.
Hmm.
The way you spell it out, it makes complete sense, but I would have no idea that that was such a critical piece
It
of,
is.
of the
Absolutely it
puzzle
is.
of it all. So yeah, yeah, yeah. Moving into this other segment here, a water cooler story segment. And I'd love to hear if you have any meaningful stories related to the work that you're involved in that you'd like to share with us.
There was a project that I was doing in Europe. It was a project done by winning a competition, which is always a nice thing because basically means they choose what you do because of some idea that you have and then you win. And basically that's usually very straightforward. In this case, the difficulty part is that we won this competition. It was for a museum and our idea was very bold, very complicated, very challenging in all ways, especially technically and budget wise. And then basically at the end, the client was actually not the final user who was actually originally making the competition, but that was actually the construction company. But suddenly your client becomes somebody, which is something that is becoming more and more common because it's comfortable for a client to have, just a construction company say, you guys take care of it, you talk to the architect, you build it, give me the key when the opening day arrives. But then the problem is that you're working, as I was saying, collaboration is very important, but collaboration is very difficult when basically your client is basically somebody who has a different objectives than you. When the client is the real owner, both want to have an excellent architecture at the end. It's basically there's a certain conflict of interest. So this is one of the very extreme cases where you really need to know how to deal with this collaboration, which is sometimes it's a collaboration that is divergent, right? In this case, it was a very difficult project where a construction company, which was our client, wanted to reduce cost. And of course, reducing cost usually means it gets to a point where it means diminishing quality, diminishing boldness, diminishing exciting solutions. But of course, you need to put it on budget because somebody has to pay, But we were dealing with this, and it was a constant fight. Every single window we wanted to put, we had to justify it because a window cost money. Every single change we wanted to do, it was a big fight. The construction company wanted to reduce the building in all ways, size, and it was very hard. It was basically a battle. Sometimes maybe on Friday I would be called and say, I'm in Japan, I have to go to Europe. No, Monday at 9 a.m., I want you here because there's some harassment, even like this kind of situation. It was very hard. But I remember 1 year after finishing the building, it was Christmas, and then we finally at the end, you get along with everybody because at the end of all the difficulties, everything goes smooth. You get along. I became good friends with this client, construction company was with us, so we kept in touch. Christmas, birthdays, etc. And on the first Christmas after finishing the building, I received a letter. It was the Christmas card, but then also a letter. And the letter said, after finishing the project and after 1 year of seeing the result, I really understood why your stubbornness, even aggressivity, what at that time I thought it was really unlucky thing to deal with. Finally, I know why that happened. And I really thank you for not giving up. So for me, that was a very beautiful story.
Oh, yeah. It sounded like it could have been hell for you for a little while there.
It was terrible. I mean, I cannot imagine how health goes when
Probably
you're in
not.
that situation. And then and then things go well, but then when after that, it's not that things go politically correct. Suddenly, when the other side, and sometimes it has to be ourselves too. It's not that I'm saying that we are always the good and the others are that. But when that collaboration at the end, with all the conflicts and difficulties, goes into a later understanding, we acknowledge that the other person was not evil. The other person was just very confident about the work that he's done. That for me was a very beautiful and meaningful gift that made me continue working in that way, being very stubborn. But being stubborn means also that I was very careful about the opinions and ideas that I had, because I knew stubborn was good, but then I had to be sure that you have to be stubborn about something that makes sense, no? Otherwise, you are just a jerk. Until that moment, I was doing it out of intuition and about character and how I'm built and wired. And from that on was more of an understanding of what a project means. And project means you have initial problems, you have a result, and then you have a lot of people to go into that direction. From that was probably my first, let's say, relevant building that I did. And basically that helped me to move on to next projects. It was a learning story and beautiful one, very human.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Maybe even gives you hope as well. Like if you find yourself embroiled in another, I'm sure you have, some difficult projects along the way, that there is hope that maybe down the line, that client or that individual, that group is going to come back around later and be like, okay, that was the reason, right?
Or that maybe I have to come back around later, and I'm the one who has to actually be more open to the ideas of somebody else. No? So I think that relativity of what's right and wrong, because architecture is about choices, so you have to think what's right, wrong, or not interesting. That relativity is important to know that sometimes what you have in your mind is not necessarily for whatever reason. It's not because you're better or not. It's because whatever you have in mind. You have to be open to know that you were wrong.
Yeah, reflection. Absolutely. Sounds like a big part of the work as well.
Constantly. Every day, you were asking about what's your daily life of that. So every day, actually, there's a lot of part of, and that's hard, actually, to look back into the work you have done in the last 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, and reevaluate it constantly.
Yeah. Well, keeping on this topic of reflection, and thinking about the past and obviously thinking about the future as well. I understand that, in the course of this conversation, we've shared with listeners that you've worked, again, Barcelona, you've worked on major projects there, in Tokyo, in Japan. But also, too, I understand that through our correspondence that you've actually decided recently to go off on your own and start your own firm. And I'd love
Yes.
to hear a little bit the reasoning behind that and, and how things are going.
I've been working in a big company for 20 years, and I can tell you that I've been thinking about that kind of decision the last 10. So, but the thing is that when you were working in an architecture practice that was 25, 30 people max, and now it's 400, there's not that moment where you say, I'm not learning anything else, no? So I should move on. You are constantly learning because it's not the same practice, 30 people, 100, 200, 400 people.
And these are renowned firms. I do want to emphasize for listeners as well. So, yeah.
The big firms is always very exciting. You're very respected for it. You're very looked after for it. It's somehow actually a privilege to be in that position and in a way that you have that respect, no? But I remember I was always during my career thinking, well, I will probably move on into something else, whether it's another company or whether opening my own company or to move into a different job even. I've been always been interested about music. I've been interested about art, photography, cooking, so many different things. I always thought that moment would be once I design something that I would be amazed if I see it done by somebody else. No, so I think for me that was the aim, that so suddenly you say, okay, you do it, and then you cannot really. It's difficult to evaluate it because you have suffered with that process. So when you see something you have finished, you see everything, the good and the bad things, and that. But of course, you have to take some time to see your work with a distance. But I always thought once I do a project that I always think, this is a very good build. This is if this was done by somebody else, I would consider this a masterpiece. So that moment happened, and for me, that was the moment when I said I want to do something else. Then, of course, already with knowing that what you do and you do it good and you are good at it, then it's okay. Maybe I want to move into a different step, which is maybe operating in a different way, maybe more operating in your home where your culture.
Yeah.
And after living 20 years in Japan, you are always a foreigner in Japan. And there was also family issues. It was also family issues. Nothing that it's a worry. But you start feeling that you want life, exactly, life, and all the things that also. And I start thinking also life should be a reason to make choices, not only design and work. No? So basically that was the way. And then also the practice when you start in a place where it's 30 people and then you end up becoming 400. It's actually not the same place. You are not the same person. You already put that into track and it has a certain inercy. When you start thinking, even if it's difficult, and I knew going out was going to be difficult, and it is. I tell you, it's very difficult because you go from being super respected, people going after you for things because everybody wants something from you when you are in that position. Basically, you are just you. That's all.
You got to fight for everything, right?
You are just you, and the only thing you have is what you have learned. And that's something that I learned from other colleagues that left this kind of big famous companies, and I always remember, like once you leave these kind of places, suddenly you are just you. There's nothing else. Nobody's helping you anymore, no. And that's it's interesting. It's hard, but it's interesting. But I know that I prefer that difficulty, that easiness that was becoming something.
Would you say that's a fairly normal progression for a lot of people that are successful in the field, that eventually they step out? Like something that you'd mentioned some of your other colleagues have done that? Or is it just kind of, I don't know. It really depends on the person.
I would say it really depends because there's a lot of, the progress of a career in architecture is so different from person to person. And then also when you leave that or you change practice. And there's some people who basically want to work for a company. There's some people who want to work by themselves, even though you are more limited in potential, etc. No? And it's very hard to know when is the right moment. I don't even know if that was the right moment or the right moment was in 2 years later or 10 years before. It's very hard. So for me, actually, it was a very difficult decision to take because obviously when you get to a certain level, everybody that has an interest of you not to, and they make it very difficult for you to take those steps because they don't want you to. But yeah, I think it really depends. It's very hard. And that's life. That's to be or not to be. That's the question. It's all based on intuition.
Absolutely. I know I've taken a bunch of your time here, and I do have one last question. And this is aimed at those who have an interest in the field that maybe are sitting on the fence about it. It's any advice that you'd be able to share or give. I know you've provided a lot in this episode, but any parting words of advice that you might be able to offer up to listeners? For
people who might be interested in going to the architecture world. I would say that difference with other professions, which basically it's more of a work, as you were saying, to be a very immersed architect, it's a lifestyle. So I think before becoming an architect, it's very important to understand why. No, Why you
Yeah.
want to become an architect? If you don't have a reason for that, I don't think it's the right time. Doesn't mean that you shouldn't. Maybe you need to explore other things. Like I studied photography, art, and music, etc. And then that's how I came as a Spaniard to understand that was the middle point that I was interested in. But it's not a career that you arrive because you want to get a job. Because when you become an architect, I would say a good architect, that involves your whole lifestyle and the way you see things. And so I think it's very important to ask yourself about that. And it doesn't mean that you need to be good at drawing. I think it's just that you need to be excited about being interested about things and about life in general. If you go around whatever you do, travel, going around the streets, and then you don't have an interest of the things that you see, it's going to be very difficult that you are later interested in what you are going to do later. So I think you need to be a very curious person. And that
Yeah.
curiosity, I think it's rather a must, because you're always learning when you're doing architecture. If you don't have curiosity, basically you stop learning. And so I think answering to that question, why I want to become architect, whatever reasoning it is, it's good, but you need to have a reason.
That might be a nice point to put a bow in this conversation, though. I've got to say, Javier, I've really enjoyed it from start to finish. I can't believe we're approaching the hour mark already.
Right.
Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Christopher.
Now, for those interested in learning more about Javier and his work, you can do so via his portfolio website. You can also find him on Instagram and LinkedIn. And for reference, I will have the links in the show notes. And hey, if you like today's show, please be sure to tell a friend and share. You can always rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. As well, as I mentioned off the top of the show, I do have that YouTube channel. And if you do make it over there, I would love a like, a comment, and of course, a subscribe. And finally, don't forget to join us on the next episode of Life as a... You could literally be one listen away from finding your dream job. I'm Christopher Schoenwald, your host, and until next time, don't settle for less, find the career you were born for.